I'm running as part of a national slate of LaRouche candidates here, and I have Diane Sare and Rachel Brown. You ladies want to stand up? Diane Sare in the green here, Rachel Brown. And so we are running as the only presidential, we have the only presidential policy right now. What we have with Obama is pure evil at this point. He needs to be impeached. He needs to be removed in one form or another very quickly. And what we have laid out for a platform in discussions with Mr. LaRouche is that we need to return to the core constitutional principles. And the two elements of that platform are Glass-Steagall and national banking, what Alexander Hamilton laid out. And so what I want to focus on here is, what is the Constitution? And in one sense, what, and not just simply as a document, but what is our makeup as a nation? And to get at the principles embedded in that. But again, just to make the point again, we have no leadership right now at the presidential level. We have Obama, who needs to be removed. Apparently Romney is now the front runner on the Republican side. This is not an option either. This guy will get us into wars just as fast as Obama, will continue the same police state and so on. So Obama has to be removed immediately so we can get a new candidate, open up the field again, and have a real debate on policy and a real debate on the nature of the crisis. So I want to just start out, number one, by reviewing that with Obama, we're fundamentally being launched into a constitutional crisis. And the latest phase of this is what he's done with the attack on the Supreme Court. He has attacked the separation of powers at every step along the way. But this latest phase, this is in one sense, one of the final phases in the dictatorship. Right? He's already attacked the Congress with both the Super Congress and on the issue of the violation of the War Powers Act. Right? And those are the two elements of our Constitution that the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that war and money were under the control of a Congress that had the direct representation to the population. It was and that you didn't want the executive controlling this, because this is what you have with kings and dictators. And so under Obama, we've seen this. He has attacked it with the creation of this Super Congress, which takes the power directly out of the hands of the Congress. And then with what he did with the violation of the War Powers Act. And now what we're seeing is the final phase in the attack on the Supreme Court here. So I just want to read one thing, because this issue of the Führerprinzip, which was outlined by Carl Schmitt, who was the legal theorist for the Nazi regime. And what I'm going to read is a few statements from it was after the Night of the Long Knives, which is where, of course, Hitler murdered his political opponents. Not unlike what we've begun to see with some of the recent things that have come out around people that have mysteriously died relating to those who challenged Obama. There was a whole buildup around the convention, whether or not they were going to actually have a real open convention in 2008 and let Hillary Clinton's delegates vote, let Obama's delegates vote, and have a real fight on who was going to come forward. And so in the build-up to that, there was a number of the delegates at the National Convention who wanted to have Hillary, on there, and needed a super delegate. And lo and behold, we find out Stephanie Tubbs Jones ends up dying of an aneurysm. The chair of the Arkansas State Democratic Party, somebody obviously very close to the Clinton circles, ends up getting shot in his office one afternoon, apparently very randomly. But these events, and as we see under Obama with the targeted assassinations of American citizens, that this is what you get with this guy. You're dealing with a Hitler personality. And so what this is from is after the Night of the Long Knives, when Adolf Hitler exterminated his political opposition, this was the legal justification for that. I forget the exact name of the article, but I'll just read a few things from it, which says, the leader defends the law against the worst abuse. When at the moment of danger, he directly creates law by virtue of his leadership as the supreme judicial authority. The true leader is always also judge. From the leadership flows the judgeship. And so, he goes on to just lay out that point. He says, in the greatest emergency, the highest law proves of value, and the highest degree judicially of the avenging realization of this law appears. It says, the leader determines the content and the scope of the course of action himself. And so this is what we're seeing with Obama, that it is judge, jury, and executioner. And so what we're seeing with this the attack on the Supreme Court is a final phase of securing this dictatorship, and he needs to be thrown out immediately. But I would just say this, that what we see with the case of the Libya war is, as Lynn had laid out back in October, he said, what you're dealing with is not just simply Obama as a serial violator of the Constitution, but that this war in Libya was meant to be immediately after the death of Gaddafi. They were going to move into Iran or Syria to get the much larger war that Obama's controllers wanted, right? Because right at this moment, we are dealing with the collapse of the entire international financial system. It is coming down hard and fast, and we are dealing with the question of what is the future of civilization? And that either at this point, we're going to have a renaissance of economic progress, right? What we've laid out with the different initiatives around NWAPA, space exploration, some of the strategic defense policies around the dealing with asteroids, space debris, so on, right? Or we're going to do what the British imperial networks want, which is to depopulate the planet, to maintain their system, right? Because their constitution, so to speak, is that they maintain the power of their financial oligarchy, which has existed for, centuries. These guys go back, the British Empire goes back to the Venetians go back to Rome, and you could trace it back even further than that. But their system says, under the oligarchical principle, that we will not allow scientific progress, we will not allow human creativity, and we will manage humanity like it was cattle in a barn. And so they've actively sought to destroy any kind of scientific progress within nations. And so, but the point is, the war and the dictatorship, which is how they maintain their power, they would actually just prefer that we were all sort of docile little lambs, and just accepted what their design. Hold on one second here. But they know that there is moves being made internationally to progress. That we're at a point right now where we have 7 billion people on this planet, and the rate of destruction of the physical economy can only be reversed with the kind of major projects around water infrastructure, power, nuclear power, space exploration, and so on. And so, hold on one second here. So the point is, the Hold on, let me regain my composure here. The present war drive that we're seeing, right? Which in the last week we've seen the situation around North Korea, where they were going to send this rocket up. The Japanese were saying that they were going to shoot it down. And then we also see the situation with Iran, which the P5+1 meeting was supposed to start on Friday. And this was to bring the nations of the UN together with Iran and say, how are we going to solve the problem, right? Which, of course, there is no problem. Iran has given up their nuclear weapons program. They gave it up in 2003. Every intelligence agency on the planet knows this. They're open about it. In fact, the U.S. intelligence agencies know this as well. But and then you have the situation in Syria as well, which the Assad government is supposedly fighting against the organic grassroots movement that's trying to overthrow him. But what we're beginning to find out is that this organic grassroots movement is Al-Qaeda, right? Being manipulated by the British imperial gang to create chaos and war, with the idea that these wars with Iran, Syria, or North Korea, that these are not the targets. The targets are Russia and China. And if you go back to October, at the time when the LaRouche had said that after the death of Gaddafi, that they were going to go into Iran and Syria, and that this was a war that would be targeting Russia and China, in that same month of October, you had all kinds of major initiatives between Russia and China on economic cooperation. Right? We saw initiatives around space exploration, fast breeder reactors for nuclear power, oil and gas development, railroads, including through North Korea into South Korea. And there was the beginning of an idea that economic development and progress with high technology, scientific initiatives, that this was going to be the future of mankind. And that they had offered at that time that they saw the war danger as well. And so they put on the table some of LaRouche's core policies. They put the Strategic Defense Initiative on the table, which was what LaRouche had outlined in the 1980s, to use beam weapons from space to be able to shoot nuclear warheads down, right? And to bring the Soviet scientists and the US scientists together to work on that and make nuclear warfare obsolete. And so that was in the 80s, and the Soviets eventually rejected it, but they've now brought that policy back and then upgraded it to deal with what we face with these asteroids, which, I mean, and since that time, actually, when the week that they proposed that, a asteroid the size of a aircraft carrier came between the Earth and the Moon. So, and there's actually a fairly interesting animation where in 1980 they only knew about 9,000 asteroids, and by 2010 the number was up to 500,000. Right, so we don't know how many of these things are, and we can't just rely on the lottery of, expecting that they're not going to hit us. And so this was the point. They said, they called their policy the strategic defense of the Earth. So they presented that to the Obama administration. They said, let's work together on this. We don't need to be in a showdown with nuclear war, And Obama rejected it flat out. Then they proposed at the same time a tunnel through the Bering Straits they committed to building their portion of it, a line from Yakutsk up to the Bering Straits, with the idea that they were going to meet us on the other side and use this as a core strategic partnership, which is what we should be doing right now, right? Russia is committed to developing the Siberian region, which is very rich in mineral wealth, all kinds of oil and gas, all kinds of raw materials, and so on. And they're committed to developing that. And we should be committed to developing Alaska and the Yukon, because any future development, especially in Asia, is going to require these materials up there. And so that should be the partnership, and that's what Lynn has put on the table, and that's what we're fighting for as the national slate, is to say this should be the future of mankind, that we have economic cooperation amongst sovereign nations, not as the globalization policy that we see now, which is where powerful financial cartels, mineral cartels, what is the British Empire, what we used to call the British East India Company, but that's what's now called globalization today. And what they say is, no, we run the world, you all are the peasant class, and we will prevent nations from cooperating on these kind of economic initiatives, and instead pit people against each other under the so-called divide and conquer tactics, right? So this was the point. Back in October, when Lynn said they're going for war against Russia and China, it was to do exactly that, to shut down this potential. Because to maintain their system, they need to do what we're seeing now in Europe, right? The Euro system is now in a complete and utter meltdown. We have a situation in Greece where it's extreme poverty. Unemployment is, I think, officially up in like 26%, I believe. You have this, I think, as a real marker of where things stand in terms of human dignity. There was a situation where a 70-year-old pensioner who had his, I think his monthly pension was somewhere around 1,000 euros, and it got cut back to around 680, something like this, and was realizing that he was being forced to go dig in garbages. And so what he did is he actually went down to the square in front of the Parliament building and wrote a suicide note saying that it was the loss of the dignity of his life, of what had been happened to Greece under this bailout policy. And he said, I'm not going to live in this, and set himself on fire. And so this has actually sparked a whole new wave of protests, because it's symbolic of what's actually happening right now. People's lives are being gutted and taken away from them to maintain the financial values of this financial oligarchy, the British Empire. And what are we seeing here? It's the same policy, right? 1 out of 7 Americans is on food stamps. Right? We have unemployment that is well over 20% in real unemployment. And if you look at the younger generation, there is just a complete moral collapse. So what is needed at this point is to functionally, what we have to do, of course, is once Obama goes, we bring GlassSteagall back. And this will, as people probably know, what GlassSteagall does is it says, we are not obligated as a sovereign nation of paying for Wall Street and international bankers' gambling debts. They are the ones that created their debt, these gambling swindles, and let them pay for it. But they created it, and we're not going to throw it on our shoulders and make us pay for it by systematically slashing living standards, which is what we're seeing. And so once GlassSteagall is, as a first step, will wipe out a mountain of worthless financial values off the bank's books of the bank. And then, but what we'll find at that point is that we don't have enough so-called real money. In other words, financial paper that's actually tied to legitimate physical economic assets. And so at that point, we're going to need to put new money into the system, new credit. Will have to be generated, but this credit has to be tied to a physical economic, not just projects, but rather a process of the quality of continual advancement. And by that in an economic process, we always are dealing with attrition, which is, what we're beginning to see, say, with oil, right? Where you're on a set resource base, and as you consume that resource, the access to it becomes increasingly more difficult. So the essential point of attrition is that the work you have to put in relative to the work you get out of it eventually becomes a net loss, right? That somewhat what we're seeing with all this fracking up in the tar sands, right? You have to this intense process to get the oil out of the shale and haul it up and so on, right? So that's what we're dealing with in an economic process. So in an economy, you always have to be moving to the higher orders of energy flux density. Right? In the case of what we see, just as a quick sketch, you can think of it from the standpoint of the amount of wood that's required for a certain value of energy, right? Versus the amount of coal that would be required, versus the amount of oil, versus the amount of nuclear fission, uranium for nuclear fission, versus a fusion process. And then beyond that, there's matter, antimatter, and so on. But what you're doing is you're always, the amount of material required to get the same amount of energy, or in the inverse, the same amount of material gets you increasingly more amounts of energy. And so what projects like NWAPA represent is a baseline of activity to facilitate that kind of unending progress. And that's what the credit of your economy should be based on. The credit of your, the financial values should be based on that quality of scientific and technological advance. That's the only qualified value of it. And so that's, as a first step, GlassSteagall, this credit system, what Hamilton laid out, is the national banking policy. That's the second step. But what that means and what that encompasses are the kind of projects like NWAPA, Arctic development, the space exploration, and so on, right? And so I just want to cover just a quick thing here, which is that the fight that we've led around GlassSteagall is now beginning to break out in Europe as well. As Europe goes into this bone-crushing austerity, one of LaRouche's longtime associates, Jacques Cheminade, who's run for president of France in the past, he's having a lot of fun there now. 1995, they tried to wipe him off the political map. They ran a major attack on his campaign, eventually, saying that there was some sort of election fraud, so on, the usual line that they run. Took everything from him. He wasn't a rich man by any means. They eventually took the folding chairs out of his apartment, just to give you a sense of how far they went after him, right? But he knew what the mission was and said, I continue to fight. And so what he has just now, well, it was about 2 months ago, where he had secured the relevant amount of petitions, where in France you have to get 500 petitions of mayors or other elected officials, which then gets you on the ballot. But once you get onto the ballot, you get equal airtime as all the other presidential candidates, including Sarkozy, right? So, and that means primetime spots, and it's actually a relatively fair system. And so Jacques has been having lots of fun. In fact, I'll just give you one sense of this. He was on one interview, and then about the last 2 minutes, they had the Obama with the Hitler mustache on the screen behind him, and they were asking him, this is your associate LaRouche, and do you support this image, and do you really think Obama is like Hitler? And Jacques laid it out, this question of austerity and how fascism actually begins, and that this is what you're seeing under Obama. And then he had another exchange with, through Sarkozy was on a program right after him. And so the guy that was running the interview with Sarkozy said, well, Jacques Cheminade actually has a question for you, which is on the fact that the euro is falling apart, and which caused Sarkozy to, sort of gave this sigh and tried to justify the fact that he had done, that they were turning the corner now on the economic recovery. And but of course, then the moderator jumped in and said, well, are you actually looking at the situation here with the disintegration of the euro, So it's Jacques standing out and saying what needs to be said. And his entire campaign is a world without the City of London and Wall Street, and has played a crucial role right now in European politics, highlighting what the nature of this collapse is, that this is the British Empire that is running this. And another just quick element on the GlassSteagall is the Italian Parliament, the Italian Senate actually introduced a bill to instate Glass-Steagall type measures, the separation of the commercial and investment banking. Then some activists within the Lega Nord then we're trying to get it into the lower house, which requires a petitioning phase. And on the day they began the petitioning, the Italian authorities raided their office and tried to shut them down, right? So we know what the battle is. The battle is the fight against this British financial oligarchy whose entire international banking system is now melting down. And to maintain their power, they are going for dictatorship, to crush the nations that have submitted to, that are not, that they want to submit to their policy, like, as we see in Europe under the austerity, as we see here, that we're not fighting this, other than what we're doing to lead it. Now, those nations that have refused to capitulate, like Russia and China, they're threatening them with war, and thermonuclear war at that. That this is the nature of where we stand right now. And so I just like to end on looking at what our Constitution is. That the quality of, actually, just as a thought on this, think of your individual constitution, like what actually constitutes us. People probably know, but every 7 years or so, all of your cells actually are replaced. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because what is it that actually makes up you? If everything that ever was a part of you was at one time not a part of you, what is it that makes you up? And what's your constitution? What's that?
The generative. Yeah.
So, in the case of our country, just as a quick sketch on this question of economics, it's the quality of advancement through scientific and technological progress that makes our existence possible. And so, in terms of the Constitution of the United States, when we have put it on the table that the national platform of the LaRouche slate is GlassSteagall, national banking, and NWAPA as the core project over the next generation, that is a reflection of our ability to transform as a continual transformation in society, always through higher ordering, as in we're outliving the constant attrition that we face. And we do this through the qualities of scientific and technological advancement. And so I think I'll just leave it at that for the moment.